5.
Starmer really is a very, very dismal leader at a time when things feel pretty bad.
4.
And I do think that it is quite unusual for a government with a majority of this size to think it needs to relaunch.
3.
People talk, oh, is this 97? Is it 90? And all that sort of stuff. No, it's more like 1975.
2.
Doing the apparently quite simple task of switching on the Downing Street Christmas tree lights, but managing to infuse it with all the pizzazz of a crematorium on a rainy Thursday afternoon.
1.
Exterminate!
Yay! It worked! Nervous moment there, but it's all good.
Welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Alison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. Now, that wasn't me counting down there, pretending to be Virgil from Thunderbirds. Or was it Scott? That was Keir Starmer, counting down a Christmas light switch on as we move into December. And after just 5 months in office, and despite a parliamentary majority of around 170, the Prime Minister and Labour leader is today, Thursday, relaunching his government. Despite a general election campaign, a King's speech with countless bills, and Chancellor Rachel Reeves' budget, Starmer feels the need to give a much-trailed speech outlining the direction in which his government intends to travel. To say Labour's first months in office have been tricky would be an understatement. The decision to cut winter fuel allowance while immediately handing out big public sector pay rises has caused anger. Higher employer national insurance contributions and inheritance tax on farms are widely seen as broken manifesto pledges. GDP growth, which Labour has championed rhetorically, has fallen sharply, and with consumer and business confidence now at its lowest ebb since the COVID-era lockdown. Meanwhile, Starmer's popularity ratings have plunged. Lots to discuss as ever, Alison, as well as Labour's relaunch, new immigration figures that are frankly shocking, and the BBC's reeling amidst allegations aimed at cheeky chappy MasterChef presenter Greg Wallace, both of which you've written about in Wednesday's Telegraph, link in the show notes to this episode. But first and foremost, dear co-pilot, amidst a diet of news woe, there's one bright shining star. In the aftermath of your Kafkaesque experience of being accused of a hate crime, you've been on a massive health kick. Where are we now in the Planet Normal squeeze into the cockpit weight loss competition?
I don't want to alarm listeners, but every time I see you, keep pulling your trousers out at the front, which isn't a Greg Wallace gesture. Seems alleged Greg Wallace gesture. It seems to be connected to the fact you wish to show me that your stomach is retreating.
I'm trying to compete with you as you waste away. God, Alison Pearson turns sideways and almost disappears.
Well, I had some good news this week, actually, after, as everyone knows, a bit of a bumpy ride in the rocket, thanks to Essex Police. So I went to see my lovely doctor, Rob, on Saturday. And I've been looking forward, Liam, after this sort of almost 4 months now of being on the dreaded Mounjaro jab, and we got the results back, and he awarded me a Blue Peter badge from the doctor. So body mass reduced by 14%, weight reduced from 77 to 65
kilos.
Kilos. No longer pre-diabetic. Hooray. Bad cholesterol, LDL, reduced by 30%, and triglycerides, whatever they are, reduced by 40%.
Aren't they some kind of dinosaur, sort of cousin of Triceratops?
Anyway, it's all good. And I think it just does show, actually, that everything now back in the normal range, plus being able to annoy you.
Well, that is the main reason. And I am even more intimidated now. There am I getting by on, good old-fashioned blokish willpower and my trusty steed rowing machine. But I'm trying to give you a run for your money. Substance-free.
Substance-free.
We shall see who wins.
We shall.
In the end.
I think we can't let it pass without comment. That wonderfully charismatic countdown that we had at the top of the podcast. I mean, literally a man who could clear a pub with that Dalek voice, isn't it? That was our Prime Minister doing the apparently quite simple task of switching on the Downing Street Christmas tree lights, but managing to infuse it with all the pizzazz of a crematorium on a rainy Thursday afternoon.
Which plastic Thunderbird puppet did you have a crush on? Was it Scott or Virgil?
It was Scott, yeah.
Before David Cassidy, you were fixated.
Yeah.
A prepubescent Alison on a Thunderbird puppet. That's a bit weird.
Scott was absolutely gorgeous and indeed far more vivacious and indeed lifelike than Sir Keir Starmer. I did think that, that Starmer doing the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 countdown, it has kind of taken off on social media with enormous numbers of people piling in gleefully as to how just truly terrible it is. In fact, there's a very interesting contrast with somebody had posted Boris's Christmas lights turn on and just, lots of atmosphere and fun and so on. And I think there's a kind of serious point here, Liam, isn't there? Is Starmer really, really is a very, very dismal leader at a time when things feel pretty bad and he makes them worse. And as you said at the top, we've got this astonishing thing of a new government with a terrific majority having what many could see as the humiliation of a reset today. We're actually recording, obviously, the day before. And let's just reflect on the fact that Labour had 14 years to prepare for government, obviously got that huge majority, and they have set up 67 reviews, task forces and committees to tell them what to do. And that's 67 reviews, 149 days. And that's everything from a strategic defence review to, wait for it, an inquiry about a sugar tax on milkshakes. So this is a very, very odd and directionless government. What do you think?
Sometimes reviews can be a good idea when there's a genuinely intractable problem that's just come up. But when you've been in opposition for many years and you've had a lot of time to think about what you want to do, it seems strange to come into government and then launch lots and lots of reviews. They're just a symptom of the fact that there's a lack of leadership, a lack of ability to make and implement decisions. And I do think that it is quite unusual for a government with a majority of this size to think it needs to relaunch. But is it any wonder? There is a sense typified, I think, by that petition, which we're not talking about now, but which I think has been a milestone in this government, with millions of people calling for a new general election just 5 months after.
Almost 3 million now, I think.
Yeah, it is gradually ticking up. But I also think the backdrop in terms of the economy is getting quite worrying now. We've seen growth fall very sharply from 0.7% to just 0.1% in the third quarter of this year. And when you have slow growth, the financial numbers look much more tricky. There's less money to hand out. Business gets very antsy, if you like, and this sort of love-in. I was at the Spectator Parliamentarian of the Year Awards last night. We can talk about those in more detail a bit later. But I did end up talking to quite a lot of people at the top of the Labour government. And there seems to be, they don't really understand how people feel about the budget. They feel that the budget seems to have landed quite well. That's what one of them said to me. Meanwhile, business leaders who very much clapped Rachel Reeves into the Treasury, as it were, wanted her to succeed, wanted Labour to do well. I think lots of us who commentate on these things, whether you're a member of a political tribe or not, you want the country to do well. You want an opposition to come in and make a fist of it in order to enhance our democracy. But I think there is a sense that the government, with the best will in the world, just doesn't really know what it's doing, typified by those reviews, as you said, but also now by indices of business confidence, as I said at the top, which are at their lowest level since COVID-era lockdown. That's not good.
I don't feel a smidgen of sympathy for these business people who back Labour, Liam, quite honestly. You had the chef Tom Kerridge spoke out for Labour, marvellous Labour government, and now wailing about the fact of how much it's going to cost his restaurant business to pay all these increased national insurance contributions for employers and so on. And they've really got egg on their face. And this idea that the cabinet thinks that the budget has landed well. I mean, I'm not sure what polling they're looking at, but, out here in Normalsville. People are talking about not having a big Christmas. Now, that's something I hear in the shops the whole time. Retailers are saying people aren't coming in and splurging, where our family is the same, really kind of having a very quiet Christmas. Now, this did make me laugh because listeners will have seen that the Transport Secretary Lou Hague had to go, didn't she, the first cabinet minister to bite the dust because of something on a criminal record to do with not returning a phone to an employer, allegedly. I'm not quite sure of the details. But to replace Lou Hague at Transport, they appointed Heidi Alexander. And this was being trumpeted on social media by people like Alistair Campbell, new Transport Secretary, first time in history that the entire cabinet is state educated, to which one wit replied, yes, fantastic confirmation of the benefits of private schools, which I thought was absolutely right. And just also to say, this is a bit of fun that we've been having, Liam, isn't it? So it's Starmer's reset speech today, and various people have been setting up bingo cards where you can have a shot of something during, as Starmer speaks in his inimitable, charismatic fashion. So my dad was a tool maker, £22 billion black hole, fixing the foundations, 14 years of Tory failure.
Sausages.
Our phone was cut off. Smashed the gangs.
My mum was a nurse. Get a grip on public spending and delivering for the working people. So I would jot those down because I think the only way now to get through this reset speech is going to be a drink. But look, things are very, very bad. And as you say, Liam, Rachel Reeves, who I think is, if I'm looking a shadow of my former self, she's looking pretty gaunt and haunted, I think, by her budget. And last week at the CBI, when she received a very frosty reception, she promised them, the CBI, that she would not be coming back with more borrowing or taxes, which even a economics numpty like me knows isn't a promise that any chancellor can make. And particularly, Liam, given the... Should ever make, because it hems you in badly.
They're not very good at politics, are they? That's what strikes me. They're just not very good at politics. And this particularly something you've been talking to me about, which is the ongoing crisis in France, which you've talked about before, with the bond markets are drumming their fingers, aren't they? And have got some implications over here as well.
That's right. Again, at the Spectator Awards last night, of course, it was a bit of a sort of Westminster media love-in. On the other hand, there was some politics going on of really national importance. For instance, I think really riffing off the Starmer Bingo that's been knocking around among journalists and the broader public on social media, Wes Streeting gave a tremendously sure-footed, funny, confident speech, responding to heckles from the crowd, and very, very skillfully. And certainly on the table that I was sitting with other journalists, there was a sense that this is designed, this speech, to contrast with his leader, to demonstrate his rhetorical fluency, his clear thinking, a massive contrast with the Christmas lights countdown. And other senior Labour people I spoke to, I tried to engage in conversation with one of them and got chided by someone else on the table for talking about boring things at dinner, literally, about this crisis in the European Union that's emerging. And I'm not saying this in any snarky way, oh, it's the European Union. I'm just looking at it analytically. And financial markets are incredibly worried about the French budget situation. French government debt has absolutely rocketed to around 60% of GDP, as a previous Planet Normal guest pointed out. It's up there with North Korea in terms of the size of the government. And back in 2010, of course, when there was a huge lurch on Eurozone bond markets, and people like me who for years had been saying that perhaps the single currency could collapse at some point because it's badly designed, we were proved right. It became clear that a single currency can and will collapse unless there are big fiscal transfers between countries. That's what economic logic and history shows. There's a sense now that that could happen again in financial markets. And I say that with huge, huge regret, because that will impact financial markets and lives and livelihoods and politics across the world. The difference, Alison, between 2010, 2011 and now is that the debts of the governments are much bigger, and Germany, the Eurozone paymaster, is poorer and angrier. And, German politics is going through palpitations over the question of, do we keep bailing out the Eurozone? Do we keep bailing out the Club Med countries, as they're rather pejoratively known, with France at the core? And this is what is worrying financial markets. And I hate to sound like a broken record, but if we do enter some kind of really difficult period on financial markets, the public are going to be saying, as the late Her Majesty the Queen said, why didn't anyone see this coming? Well, some of us are suggesting that this could happen, and we should be taking steps in order to reassure financial markets about the state of our public finances. Meanwhile, Labour is ploughing on, taxing and spending in an overly, I think, ideological way, and that could have very serious implications.
Well, you have been saying, I remember you saying before, even before Labour got elected, by the way, nice stat here, one Velma stat. Let's have a Velma stat.
What have I created? What kind of Frankenstein bond analyst have I created?
No, this is not a bond one, but at the general election, let's remind ourselves, folks, if we ever feel fed up with our country, let's remind ourselves that at the general election, the people who voted for Labour, 9,731,363. People who didn't vote for Labour at the general election, 57,595,206. So this is the background. This is the very interesting and precarious situation.
It's 1 in 5 of the electorate voted for Labour.
Yeah, so it looks super safe, but as we've said, and with reform very much now, I mean, this may seem a bit sort of political in gossip, but a very prominent Conservative commentator, Tim Montgomery, who worked for Boris Johnson and set up Conservative Home, Tim this week has announced that he's joining Reform. And Tim Montgomery is by no means on the right of the Conservative Party. Tim would be pretty much bang in the middle. So his endorsement, again, people might think, well, he's not a national figure. No, but he's influential and he could make a few people. We had the previous week, we had Dame Andrea Jenkins, previous Tory MP, also joining Reform. So seeing Reform now picking up some very respectable people. And I believe that Nigel Farage picked up an award last night and was his usual shy, retiring self, Liam, at the Parliamentary Awards.
Indeed. Michael Gove now, of course, is in charge of The Spectator, and some of the political awards they gave were designed to wind up the government. Politician of the Year was Angela Rayner, which won't please Keir Starmer. You had Politician to Watch was Robert Jenrick, which, of course, may slightly unnerve people close to the top of the Tory party.
Yeah.
Resignation of the Year, we must mention our dear friend Rosie Duffield, who I stood up and gave a standing ovation to, and as did some other people in the room. She, of course, is still having a very hard time with the Labour Party. And then you had Nigel Farage, and rather mischievously, he was awarded Newcomer of the Year, having just entered Parliament, even though, of course, he's been conducting politics on the national stage for 30 plus years and more. I've said to you often, Alison, I think that at the time of the next election, Reform, with 5 MPs at the moment, they've got 5 MPs and yet they're 7-1 to form the next government. The Lib Dems have got more than 70 MPs and they're 100-1 to form the next government. At the time of the next election, I think Reform will have at least 10, possibly 15 MPs through defections and by-elections. And it doesn't give me any pleasure to say that. And then who knows at the general election? It will all depend on the extent to which Reform can do what Nigel Farage says he wants to do in terms of aping the Lib Dems. What does that mean? What the Lib Dems are very, very good at, as the figures I've just outlined show, they're very good at concentrating their support and their efforts in particular constituencies to win particular constituencies. Reform are going to stand in all 650 seats. There is talk of lots of money coming into the party, not least from your new bestie, thanks for that, Elon Musk, but many other former Tory donors are speaking to Farage. I know that for a fact. Can they concentrate their support on a certain number of seats, though, as they roll out their national candidate list at the next general election? And Nigel Farage, he gave an absolute bombshell of a speech. They're quite short and sharp speeches at the Spectator Awards, as indeed they should be. And he basically said to the audience, you guys don't know what's coming. We are going to win hundreds of seats next time. And he sat down to near silence, except a few renegade reform supporters in the room shouting and cheering in a kind of vigil for Nigel Farage. It was a particularly poignant political moment, I think. And I think a lot of people will write about that moment when the history of this period is written.
You said it doesn't give you much pleasure to think of reform picking up these seats during the course of this parliament. It gives me great pleasure, Liam. It really does, because I want a functioning Conservative Party. I want the Conservative Party to really regroup and rediscover the values that millions of people like me support, which they betrayed, notably in those absolutely horrifying immigration figures. June 2023 to June 2024, almost 1 million people allowed into our country. Not just 1 million people, Liam, not 1 million productive people coming here to pay huge amounts of tax and boost GDP and get that growth going that we've been promised. The vast majority of those people are not here to work, okay? They are dependents, they are students, they are the dependents of students, they are asylum seekers, they are humanitarian candidates. Absolutely. I can't really sum up how angry I am about this. If you look at our country with the struggles that millions of normal people are having to access decent healthcare, find a dentist, young people to find a home, to start a family, everywhere we look, the British people are on their uppers, struggling, and our government, not just this government, which probably won't make it any better, although you can, of course, now, what the Conservatives have done in their absolute cloth-eared stupidity is give Keir Starmer an ability to stand up and make a speech saying the Tories ran an open border experiment. Can you imagine how mad that is, that the Conservative government can be accused by Labour? I mean, Keir Starmer, as we know, a long-time fan of open borders and renouncing Brexit and so on. The thing he's had the real cheek to say, Starmer, is that, this wouldn't have happened, this dreadful immigration tsunami, had it not been for all those thick people like us who voted for Brexit. We voted for Brexit to get control of our borders. That was why millions of people, many of whom had not voted, who had really no faith in the political class, came out of their homes, went down to the polling stations in Wales and in the northeast and in the east of England, and they voted so that they didn't have their country and its culture overwhelmed by millions and millions of strangers coming in. And this is where we've got now. Unfathomable changes to our communities from these numbers of people that cannot be absorbed. And why is this? And I'm going to, it's the Treasury. Let's grow GDP quickly through the shortcut of allowing millions of people to come into our country. And the end result is infinitely poorer quality of life and more struggle for British people. And I think now this is such a vast, epoch-defining issue. I think it could well see Nigel Farage becoming the Prime Minister. We've had Kemi Badenoch apologising last week for the Conservatives' record on immigration. But let's just see going forward. It feels like a really pivotal moment to me. Unless things change, unless we see Kemi really getting her act together quickly, I will back reform.
Okay, let me justify what I said. Before I do, I wanted to give an honorary mention to a really fantastic politician, not a household name, who the Spectator last night made Parliamentarian of the Year, and that is James Arbuthnot, who was the MP absolutely at the forefront of helping Alan Bates and other post office submasters get at least some kind of justice. Of course, the compensation is very, very slow coming. The state machine, endless people working from home, they can't seem to get into gear. But I just want to mention James Arbuthnot. Okay, why did I say what I said? I am, as you know, extremely mindful of the relationship between the Tories and Reform. I speak to people very senior in both parties all the time. And the reason I'm very, very concerned is that I do believe that this government could quickly collapse in financial turmoil. I genuinely believe that. And I don't say things like that and write them lightly at all. And if we get to that point and the right of British politics is still rowing and there's a massive split between Tories and Reform, however gleeful that makes people who are angry with the Conservatives, that split will allow Labour to win again, possibly in cahoots with the SNP and the Lib Dems as some kind of grand coalition of the fiscally incontinent left. And that could lead to major, major issues for our country, which go way beyond the niceties of political rivalries and party politics. I don't want to over-dramatise this, but if this Labour government gets into serious trouble and the right of British politics is rowing with itself, the British population and the world will lose faith, I believe, in the ability of this country to govern itself in an effective way. And that will be an absolute tragedy. So what I want is I want Reform and the Tories to actually start talking rather than rowing. And that, Alison, is why I said what I said. Now on to our Planet Normal guest. This week, we're delighted to welcome back to the Rocket former Cabinet Minister, the Tory MP for the Yorkshire seat of Goole and Pocklington, David Davis. David first entered Parliament in 1987, and having served as Minister of State for Europe, Chair of the Commons Public Accounts Committee and Brexit Secretary, he is of course a major figure in British public life. Known for his independence of thought, David's widely admired for his campaigning zeal, not least when it comes to civil liberties. Brought up on a council estate in South London, he's a grammar school boy with a degree in molecular and computer science. Before standing for Parliament, he established a successful business career. A former Tory leadership candidate, David remains hugely influential in his party, not least because he's been around for a long time, having cut his political teeth as a junior aide during the 1975 leadership campaign of a certain Margaret Thatcher. I started by asking David Davis if, after 37 years in the Commons, it ever crossed his mind not to stand in this year's general election.
Oh, I went through that thought process back in 2019. And the reason I did was because when I went into cabinet, I thought somebody else would pick up all my rule of law, civil liberties, anti-surveillance, anti-unnecessary foreign wars, that sort of package, which loads of journalists are interested in, loads of NGOs helped me with, and so on. It was a sort of little industry by itself. And I thought when I went to the cabinet, some smart young thing would pick this up and run with it. Nobody did. So when I came out of cabinet, I had to pick it up again and run with it. Until I get an inheritor of this process, I'm afraid you're stuck with me.
You have made civil liberties a real part of your kind of political brand, if I may say so. You've made many stands on civil liberties and free speech over the years. I know you listen to Planet Normal. Alison and I talk to you regularly. What have you made of her case? And I wouldn't even say from afar, because I know you've been very supportive of her.
Yeah, well, it's frankly, it's a piece of modern lunacy. You hear people go on about, the sort of cultural changes in Britain. The most corrosive has been the attack on free speech more generally, because, we forget, we actually don't teach our youngsters anymore. Free speech is what makes this country what it is. And it wasn't, I'm not just talking the sort of constitutional importance and the individual protection from the state and all that. It's also important because it's why our science is so magnificent. It's why our industry, why we were the leader of the Industrial Revolution. We forget a lot of that is about people's freedom to talk and think and discuss and disagree with each other. And what Alison has showed us is that, one, nobody's immune. You'd think if anybody was immune from this, it would be a journalist, let alone a leading journalist like her. And secondly, the fact that the institutions of the state have now taken up doing this, not just people on social media, but an actual respectable police force, thought it was worthwhile doing at the same time as complaining about not having enough resources, is just madness and incredibly corrosive of the sort of country we are and would hope to stay, I think.
How do you think the police have played this, Essex police in particular? We've had many emails from rank and file boys and girls in blue, literally tearing their hair out, upset at what they're asked to do. Where is this animus coming from within the police?
Well, it's not just within the police, sadly. I think Essex have just made fools of themselves, truth be told. I imagine most of their colleagues in other police forces up and down the country are looking aghast at their sense of priorities. But the truth also is that some of this, not more than some of it, a lot of it, comes from the centre. The phrase non-crime hate incident, I think that's the phrase they used, is ridiculous. But it's been defended even by Conservative Home Office ministers. So this sort of starts in a Home Office. And I can remember, look, I'm quite an admirer of Chris Philp. I think he's a very intelligent guy and a great future Home Secretary. But even he was defending the idea of these things at the same point as he was restricting them. And the way he defended them was by saying, well, it might lead to a crime in the future. It might lead to, presumably, by which he means a sort of racism or incitement to violence or something like that. But, this country is not into pre-crime. It's not into trying to interfere in people's thought processes so that they don't do something bad later. We deal with crimes when they happen. So some of it starts there. And I can give you a sort of local demonstration. My local police force is a fabulous police force. Humberside's gone from way down the batting order to top in the country virtually in terms of dealing with crime and so on. Yet even they sent me a crime number last week, not about me, but about somebody who's tweeted, I think, 400 times, attacking me online, accusing me of all sorts of things. I didn't even know it was happening. And yet he was given a crime number because I was supposedly being harassed. Now, I think it's been dropped now because I said, don't worry about it. But, they're doing that not because they want to, but because there are a set of central rules. And so the Home Office, the Royal College of Policing, all of them, I'm afraid, have got their fingers in this pie. And that demonstrates the point I was making. This is British institutions getting seduced into this ridiculous PC, if there is such a thing, it's sort of PC fascism. It's literally trying to tell people what to think and punishing for their thought process, something we only thought applied to totalitarian states in the past.
Do you think there's a gaming of the system going on by senior police? If you can take one of these so-called non-crime hate incidents, if you can go and feel someone's collar, then you can then tick that off as a successful outcome. It's a lot easier than catching burglars, isn't it? It's a lot easier than actually policing the streets. Do you think there is some gaming of the statistics here, police forces, top brass wanting to show that they're being successful?
There are not too many crimes you can police from a comfortable, warm office. That's for sure. So that might be happening. I can't prove that one way or the other. I would be unsurprised. Also, to some extent, over the years, I suspect that policemen with slightly more PC turn to their character and approach probably have been favoured in terms of their promotion prospects. So it's entirely possible and maybe probable that some at least have gamed the system. But as you say, the ordinary policeman hates this sort of thing. It's not being a real copper doing this. Most of the people, and I know the police have had some bad reputational things in the last few years, and some of them have really behaved monstrously. But most of our coppers are really good people. They join up to protect us, and that's what they want to do. And they don't see this as protecting the public at all. They see it as undermining the public. And so I think there's a real dichotomy here, probably between the sort of management of the police and the ordinary copper on the street, who would probably be with you and me on this subject.
You've been heavily involved with the Conservative Party literally since the early and mid-70s, and I want to come on to that. You're now a very energetic MP in his mid-70s, if I may say so. A lot of people in Parliament across the aisles, I've seen it, come to you for advice and ideas. How do you feel about the fact that these NCHIs were introduced under a Conservative government? And what would you say to the current Conservative leadership about how they should respond to this case?
Well, firstly, and I think Kemi has been pretty robust on it, is the truth be told. But the first piece of advice I'd give to them all is don't try and defend what a past Conservative government did on this. I mean, to a very large extent, the initiative for these things comes from the hierarchy, what Michael Gove used to call the blob, but basically the sort of collective views of a number of people, not everybody, but a number of people in the Home Office, and I think, and other institutions. What's happened is, frankly, ministers have been insufficiently robust, I'll put it as politely as that, in standing up to these things. And part of this actually is, the massive turnover of leaders of the party in the last decade has meant there's been a massive turnover in ministers, which means in turn that a lot of those ministers have not been there very long. And so it's tougher for them to stand up to the sort of views of Whitehall. But that's the job of a minister. Their job is to introduce, ideally, some common sense and, in a Conservative government, some Conservative values. And there are no Conservative values that lead you to a non-crime hate incident as a definition of something a policeman should do. None whatsoever. There's no Conservative justification in the world. They have been, basically, it's a function of weakness, not of deliberate mischief, but of weakness on the part of historic Conservative ministers.
Kemi Badenoch is, of course, launching a number of policy reviews, but also she has to react to events, dear boy, in the words of another Conservative leader of old, Harold Macmillan. Do you think the Tories should now say, we're going to get rid of these NCHIs? Wouldn't that really catch a wave? Wouldn't that give the Tories a lot more in common with reform than with Labour Party?
Right. The easy answer to your question is yes, we should get rid of them. Whether we should rush to do that now, it was slightly contrary to the advice I gave to Kemi, which is take your time over specifying new policies, because you've got 4 years and you don't have to necessarily come up with an alternative when you're criticising what's there now. Second point, I would not drive any policy as a way of, as it were, positioning ourselves to the right of reform. Right. And I say that because if we position ourselves to the right of reform, Nigel will move himself another few yards right of us. I know Nigel very well. He's an old friend of mine. Indeed, I've helped him out on 1 or 2 occasions on personal things. But, I know what he's like. He's the man who wanted to burn the golf club down. So we shouldn't try and make him a member.
I didn't mean the Tories should go to the right of reform. I meant they should move nearer reform.
I'd put it slightly differently. I'd say if we find an issue where our principles say this is wrong, the only thing I'd say is move faster than reform. Make sure that we are the people that champion it. Don't try and follow reform, lead reform on some of these issues. And this is one of them. I could list you half a dozen, but this is one where actually we should be taking the lead. So in that respect, I agree. But, there's 2 levels of a criticism of this. One is just taking away the whole thing. And I agree with you. That's where we should end up. Whether we do it now is another matter. It's a sort of tactical issue, really. But secondly, the way it's been applied in Alison's case, and not just Alison, other people's cases as well, the way it's been applied is monstrous, literally monstrous. Going after somebody a year after the event, even if what she said in the first case was wrong, a year after the event, a year after it's been taken down.
Not even telling her the tweet, which is obviously the main plot line of Kafka's The Trial.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Literally. The idea that the police force can tell you that you're even being investigated without telling you what about is in defiance of British justice. I think in the days of Henry II, you'd ask for better than that, let alone now. It's bonkers, and a police chief constable with any common sense at all would have seen it was bonkers.
What are your thoughts on what else your party should be doing? I do want to talk to you about the mid-70s. We were having a discussion earlier, and you told me about your involvement with the leadership campaign of somebody called Margaret Thatcher. We'll talk about that. But doesn't that experience give you the imprimatur, if you like, give you the capacity to tell your party now, the leader of which was born in 1980, doesn't it mean that you should be really trying to advise them on what they're doing in a historic context? Because even if a lot of the leadership don't remember the 1970s and the winter of discontent, an awful lot of the electorate do.
Yeah. Before we get too carried away, bear in mind I basically just did the photocopying.
You were in the room, David Davis. You were in the room. In the words of Hamilton the musical.
You know what? Sometimes when you're the most junior person, people don't even see you, so they carry on talking as though you're not there. So you hear some interesting things. But to come back to your modern point, I mean, there is an analogy. I wouldn't put it any more than that, about where we are now and where we were then. People talk, is this 97? Is it 90? And all that sort of stuff. No, it's more like 1975. Why do I say that? Because the issues in 1975 were thought to be impossible. The generic view, I won't detail them all, there are loads of them, you can look them up, but the generic view was the role of the British ruling class, the Whitehall and the rest of them, to manage the decline of Britain. End of empire and all the rest of it, losing out to the Soviets abroad, all of that stuff. We're to manage the decline of Britain. And Thatcher challenged that. Well, today, we've got apparently intractable problems all over the place. War in Ukraine, what's the answer to that? Chaos in the Middle East, what's the answer to that? At home, a National Health Service which, no matter how much money we put into it, and it has been spectacular sums, is still actually treats less people each year rather than more. Our social mobility is as bad as it's ever been. Kids,
100 billion quid a year of spending on debt interest on
absolutely.
Government debt.
100% of GDP in debt. Kids can't get houses, and yet they end up with the equivalent of a mortgage for their lives because if they've been to university. All these things look intractable. Now, what Thatcher did was to slice these intractable problems up into small bits and fix them. And it's no accident, really. She was both a lawyer and a scientist. And Kemi is a lawyer and an engineer by training. And her approach is quite similar. And she's got very strong principles, which she's very happy to espouse, sometimes in the face of a gale of opposition. But also, she's ultra analytical, which is one of the reasons I supported her, because I'd looked at these problems and thought, we need somebody who's got real brain power to take these apart.
You did. You were an early supporter.
That's correct. And real brain power and the courage to take her time and the courage to look at maybe solutions that nobody's looked at before. I mean, for example, even Margaret Thatcher balked at trying to resolve the problems of the health service because it was seen as a sort of Labour issue, I don't think that's true anymore. After COVID, when some of my constituents didn't get their cancer tests, their cancer diagnoses early enough, and then didn't get their treatment early enough, so they died before their time. That happened under our health service. Yeah. I had a local village, it wasn't actually my constituency, it was just next door, that almost had a sort of riot. They had a big village meeting about why they couldn't get any to see their GPs at all. So I think the public's view of the health service, whilst it still loves it, as it were, it's a little sceptical perhaps that necessarily everything it does is the best way to do things. I mean, look, yesterday I had a call from the health service saying, you've got to come and see the cardiologist in 2 weeks' time, right? This morning I got called up in my car. Sorry, Mr. Davis, we've double booked your appointment. Right? You know. So I then say, okay,
They know who you are.
yeah, well, they do actually. But then they say, oh, well, you know, can you do the next? I said, look, just text me another time and I'll call you back and confirm it. You know, but probably the Sunday is fine because there's a Sunday appointment. Sunday is fine. But it took basically 3 telephone calls to get one appointment, you know, and this happens. Oh, it drives me mad, you know. So the administration, you know, of course, it's still always got to be free at the point of delivery. Nobody's ever going to argue that call inside the party, but maybe the way we do it's just not as good as it should be, you know. Even look, and it distorts people's thinking. You know, we had this assisted dying bill on Friday, right? And Wes Streeting doesn't like it. And he's now saying, oh, it's going to cost us more money than we can afford. You know what? If you are dying of a horrible disease, which is all we're talking about, all the people we're talking about here in this category, if you're dying of a horrible disease, when's the most expensive 6 months of your life from an NHS point of view? It's the last 6 months as they desperately try and keep you alive, desperately try and treat the symptoms, desperately try and keep you out of agony. And if somebody swaps that for being inspected by a couple of doctors and having it overseen, of course, but then swaps it for a single something to ease them on their way, how is that making things more expensive?
To be clear, you've supported the bill in principle, but you've made very clear from the outset, I think mindful of your role as somebody who is very closely associated with civil liberties, you've made clear publicly from the outset you want more safeguards. You want the law to be more nuanced.
Absolutely, yeah. There are about a dozen areas where we need more safeguards. I should declare an interest. I'm 75 years old. I might be closer than that. But the truth is, yes, I have. In fact, I think I got the laugh of the day. Not a subject for laughs, but when I said to the government, I don't want to be rude, but this bill is more important than most of the things in your manifesto. So can we have some time doing it? So it is extraordinarily important, and it's extraordinarily important you get it right. It's one of these things. It's a knife edge thing. You do it wrong, people will be ending their lives too soon and improperly. You do it wrong the other way, people will be in agony for months, if not more, prior to and have a terrible death. So it's a really difficult thing to get right. And so my point being, we have to work really hard. And I've said I'll vote second reading. I'll decide on the third reading on how well we've done in fixing those 12 or thereabouts different categories of protection and authorization and so on. But to come back to Kemi, so she has, and interestingly, you see, when Rishi Sunak was in power, I offered his team half a dozen ideas I think were quite good. It was like throwing things into a black hole. None of it happened. Or at least one thing happened, it happened badly, the others didn't happen. The Kemi team and Kemi herself is really interesting because they listen to the ideas, they understand them because they're often quite technical. They involve things like using AI in education and new mechanisms of treatment in the health service and new ideas on house building, where you and I have some similar ideas, and so on. And so I think she's very well equipped to do what this country needs. To summarize my advice to her, I said to this: look, you've got these difficult problems. You've got a government that's had the worst start of any government in my lifetime. In fact, I look back to see if there was a government that had a worse start than this. And I got to 1932 and I stopped. It's been a terrible start. And so on that basis, I said, look, you've got to look at the things that they don't solve that matter to the public. They aren't always the same things. Governments fail at things that don't matter and government fails at things that do. But look at the things that they fail on that matter to the public, and we have to have the answers. Not now, but in a couple of years' time. This time, we have to think the answers through first, rather than start with a headline and work back from it. And the last, frankly, since Tony Blair, governments have over-obsessed with headlines and under-obsessed with getting the answer right in the first place and getting the headline second. So the last person to do that properly was Thatcher. She used to be always unpopular in the midterm. Always. By the time she got to year 4, people could see it working. Yeah. And that's the proper method of modern democratic government.
You are uniquely positioned in this parliament, I would say. You do have proper backroom memories of early Thatcher. You're probably using a bander machine, weren't you? Or a photocopier. Can you draw parallels between that time and today? Can you draw parallels between the Tory leader who first inspired you and the Tory leader we have today?
Well, let me deal with inspired first. First thing to say is they're both unique and they're the first of a class. Thatcher was the first woman, other than I think Golda Meir probably, to lead a major country, but certainly the first woman in Britain to be lead a party and then lead a major party and then become prime minister. And Kemi will have her own firsts, although quite rightly she says it shouldn't matter that she's black. All that matters is the content of the character. The second thing to say is lots of people have expressed doubts about Kemi, and that's what Number 10 are trying to run on at the moment. We never knew that Margaret Thatcher was going to be the success she turned out to be. We never knew, Someone like me, who was a scientist, could see that she had different skills to other people, and therefore she had a better chance. And I think the same about Kemi. So that's similar. The fact that the Labour Party was struggling right through the 70s, and the same is going to be true with this lot. They're going to be struggling with, as I say, 100% GDP and borrowing, and all of the things which the Labour Party are not very good at dealing with. They're not very good at dealing with unions. They're not very good at dealing with inflation. They're not very good at dealing with the economy, as Kemi said, even with a real economist in charge. So,
financial markets.
Yeah, naturally, they don't understand markets full stop, let alone financial markets. So there are lots and lots of parallels in that respect. And also a public, as we saw this in America with the Trump-Harris election, a public that doesn't really believe that any politician's got an answer, right? And that's what feeds the reform vote. It's not that they necessarily want reform. They just felt that nobody had an answer, so why not vote for somebody who sounds a bit more plausible, right? And we have got to be, come 4 years' time, we've got to be more plausible than the government in particular, but also reform, as you point out. We've got to have really thought through ideas. I said during the leadership election, just coming up with an idea today, the public will say, why didn't you do it last year? We've got to think it through. We've got to work it through. We've got to prove this right. And in areas like green policy, where there's huge scope for improvement. Areas like housing, huge scope for improvement. Areas like welfare, we've got welfare systems paying people to sit at home doing nothing. Huge scope for improvement, but all of them difficult. And that's just like the 70s. Absolutely just like the 70s. And also is the fact that we've got 4 years to think out the answers. That is why Kemi, for me, is the perfect prospect for the next Prime Minister.
David Davis has turned into a special extended Planet Normal interview. Could talk to you for hours. Thanks so much for appearing on the Rocket of Right Thinking.
My pleasure.
Well, there you have it, Alison. David Davis making a triumphant return to the Rocket of Right Thinking, having first appeared on Planet Normal in August 2020. He's a big beast and he can still drive a headline.
I really enjoyed that, not least because David was so ardent, not just in his support for me personally, but articulating why, for any person who considers themselves conservative, this non-crime hate incident thing it's just madness, and it should have no place in our society. And I also agree with his endorsement of Kemi Badenoch as a scientific person and as an engineer. I think he's right about the fact that what we're seeing now is sort of surface squabbles, but the entire you need to lift up the bonnet and reboot the engine of the UK. There's no doubt about it. And it's going to need someone very, very thoughtful to tackle all those things that David outlined so well. And also, as we often say on Planet Normal, Liam, I mean, look at his journey. Astonishing, isn't it? From a adopted boy on a council estate to the kind of eminence he's achieved. And I could listen to you guys chatting together for hours.
Now on to our listener emails. Your messages sent to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We learn so much from you, the citizens of Planet Normal.
The inbox is still full this week with the fallout from my run-in with the constabulary. And we have, Liam, had some terrific input from police, both serving and retired. And I'm finding the intelligence I'm gathering from them extremely helpful for our ongoing campaign to nix the nicks, as it were. Lisa says, I just wanted to say, Alison, I'm so sorry that you had to go through what Essex police put you through. It was a travesty. That said, you fought hard and won out in the end. I think you gave us all a bit of faith that fight is still important, maybe more so now than in a long time. Free speech is huge. I think we've probably all needed reminding how much we should protect it. I'm recently retired police, having served over 25 years. I have a love-hate relationship with my former profession. I was treated appallingly in my probationary period, bullied. I was a young, strong-minded woman, but I hung in there and ended up fighting for a job I wasn't even sure I liked by the end of that experience. But I'm a fighter like you, and they weren't going to get the better of me. But the cost was high and the damage lasting. I saw it exposed early on, and though I stuck it out for a quarter of a century, I was very glad to leave. Having seen what's happened to the police since, I'm almost ashamed to associate myself with that profession. How sad is that, says Lisa. In terms of non-crime hate incidents, well, they were pretty much always open to abuse. Put simply, officers lacking due diligence, experience or integrity could just record these incidents pretty much without scrutiny in a system that encouraged the recording of any incident reported as hate by anyone who perceived it as such, and in reality, by anyone who felt miffed enough, or in your case, Alison, vindictive enough to report being offended to police. I think in recent months, political motivation has also become a factor for reports to police. It was much easier to record these incidents than not, since they could be recorded and filed at source pretty much without investigation. Many were, which is why one could be recorded against any name and they wouldn't necessarily even know that they had one. Crazy, really. The recording of NCHI, says Lisa, like anything else, relies upon the integrity of the system, most pertinently the integrity of the allocated officer, who chooses, based upon the case presented, whether to record the matter as a non-crime hate incident or simply to write it off. If the matter was recorded as an NCHI, it would have a number attached to it. If not, an incident log would refer to it instead. But in any event, it was in the system. I strongly suspect that many officers simply didn't challenge the legitimacy of these reports to police and recorded them as NCHIs for the sake of ease and compliance, rather than challenging the legitimacy and integrity of the records made. In my last few years, says Lisa, I worked on a call centre investigations team. Essentially, we were presented with all non-urgent calls for service made by the public to police in the form of daily telephone appointments. We would contact the complainant and record any relevant criminal matters as crimes and any relevant non-crime hate incidents as per the guidelines. To be honest, plenty related to nonsense reported on Facebook in particular. So demoralising was the nonsense that our department was nicknamed, you like this, Halligan, the disappointments car. Which I think, says Lisa, reflects the low level of dross that got reported. Good officers with integrity dealt with these calls for service without recording them when it wasn't necessary or fair. Officers with less integrity, I'm afraid, didn't always differentiate. A good example of this was a report from a black female who reported to police that she and a white woman had argued over the last bunch of daffodils in a floral display in a supermarket. The white female grabbing the last bunch just ahead of the black female. Yes, we were expected to deal with nonsense like that. The black female had called police after the event, stating that she perceived this incident to be hate-related because she was black and the other female was white. I was allocated this incident and dealt with it on the phone. Having asked the black female why she perceived this to be hate, she could provide no further evidence aside from her skin colour. Not a single hate or racist word or action was uttered during their exchange. I didn't record this incident as an NCHI. I wasn't convinced that it met the threshold at all, but many would have, because the black female was adamant that it was hate. And that's my point, says Lisa. Stuff got recorded because it was easier to record it than to challenge it. Every day, I'm really glad that I'm no longer part of the police. Many of my former colleagues did some great work and were brave, decent people. I think lots of experience has been lost. The integrity of the system is debatable, and it all feels pretty broken. The damage done by the obvious two-tier policing of the anti-Semitic protests has been significant. In fact, so significant that I fear it's irreparable. I'm horrified by what they've done, and history will not judge them well, I fear. Trust and confidence lot. Some major police are in denial still. All a big mess of their own making, largely. Leadership is dire and woke and lost. A right old mess. Hope this helps you a bit. Keep fighting. Lisa.
That's a powerful email. And we are focusing on the fallout from the Pearson Gate NCHI episode in these emails, if only because we are getting so many emails about this, and it's crazy not to read out as many of them as we possibly can on the podcast. And a head of steam is really building behind this issue now, Alison, in the aftermath of what you went through and the extent to which that has encouraged other members of the public to start speaking about their experiences as well. This is from Mari. Hello, Alison and Liam. I can't tell you how much joy your weekly podcasts bring to me and to us as well, Mari. Sometimes. Even if the content is often controversial and contentious, which I love. Also, huge shout out to Alison for standing firm when two wet around the ears coppers dared to darken her doorstep on Remembrance Sunday, that most sacred of days. It seems the statutory code of practice for the recording of NCHIs became law in June 2023 under Section 60 and 61 of the Police Crime, Sentencing and Courts Act 2002. In your most recent podcast, I think you may have suggested it's not law, but sadly it is, and very much ripe for appeal, as you so rightly argue. What's interesting, though, and which was not applied in your case, is that the statutory code for good practice states that in recording data about an NCHI, the terms used must be complainant and subject and not victim and accuser. Those unlikely lads on your doorstep didn't even know these basics. Anyway, thought it was useful intel. I know that there are many and varying issues occupying our attention at the moment, but I would be hugely grateful if you at Planet Normal can cast your wonderful spotlight over the education tax again. This is, of course, the introduction of VAT on independent schools. It feels that us parents who are championing and funding action behind the scenes are becoming nothing more than a sideshow to the other tax blunders that Comrade Reeves and her sidekicks have introduced. We are in danger of becoming nothing more than an echo in a vast chamber. I'm part of a growing cohort on Facebook, Education Not Tax, that's the name of the group, 23,000 people and counting, of desperate parents, not born with a silver spoon in our mouths, trying to get attention for this tax of envy. We use most mediums available to us, but feel that we lack the champion of champions. Not sure if you need or want to take on another cause, but we know we need more coverage and support beyond what is already spilling out on our channel. Will you be our Boudica, Queen of War? We shall happily be your faithful followers. I raise this again today because of some of the heartfelt stories pouring out in our Facebook channel. One such story goes something as following. Parents who are moving their kids mid-year, especially those in GCSE and A-level, are fraught with chronic anxiety. But, wait for it, the worst of it is that they are now harbouring suicidal thoughts. God forbid if even one of these kids takes their own life, because it will literally be blood on the hands of government. 35,000 kids will not be attending private school next year, and many of these kids still do not have a place to occupy in the state system. These include those who have now decided not to take up a place in private school, as well as those already in the system. These stats far outweigh anything Bridget Phillipson, who's the Education Secretary of course, hinted at way back in the day. We need to keep the spotlight firmly on the injustices prevailing, and please lead us into battle, preferably a marching protest. Best wishes, Mari. Now, Alison, as you know, we've discussed it a lot between us. I am a governor of 2 independent schools. I am somebody who won a scholarship to an independent school, aged 10, strictly on academic merit. It completely changed my life. I was the first person in my family to go to university at a time when just 6 or 7% of age cohorts went to university. And I have seen with my own eyes the impact that the introduction of VAT on education, which of course is a tax on parents paying school fees, is having. What I'm saying now, I'm not representing either of the schools of which I am a governor when I'm saying this, but many, many people have contacted me as somebody in the media who has benefited from and championed independent education. This is hitting the cohorts in many cases that were locked down. I can't see that this is going to raise any money at all. Many, many independent schools are not wealthy. They run very, very small surpluses, if any surpluses at all. And the combination of VAT on school fees, which of course many schools can't pass on to parents in total, they're going to have to absorb a lot of that cost because the parents are so price sensitive, because they're holding down many jobs to send their children to independent school. Many schools are cash strapped. The combination of this VAT introduced mid-year to make it as awkward as possible, plus NIC employer contributions, which of course schools must pay, plus changes to the treatment of business rates, which are hitting schools as well. Plus. There are a lot of tax factors coming together, which I think really amount to an ideological assault on independent education. And I think, as we predicted on Planet Normal quite some time ago, I do think there's going to be legal action. I do think schools are going to try and sue the government using the very ECHR that Keir Starmer says he loves so much. And the irony is that were we still in the EU, which Keir Starmer says he loves, they couldn't tax education because it's illegal under EU rules.
Well, Mary, thanks for that great email. I absolutely share all your concern, and we will, of course, try to campaign. I've been hearing, Liam, which I'm sure you have as well, really upsetting, spiteful commentary along the lines of, oh, poor Tarquin and Tarquinetta, right?
Crazy.
Those are not the representatives. Yes, there are some of the great public schools which have got children from families with a lot of money. And by the way, they add luster to our international reputation.
And a lot of them, a fifth, a quarter, a third of kids at those schools are on some kind of financial assistance, many of them on absolutely transformational full fee bursaries.
Absolutely. And as you know from your own experience, Liam, just astonishing boosting of life chances of children. But the way that Bridget Phillipson's casual and unpleasant remarks about rolling lawns and manicured hockey pitches and so on, just disgusting from the Education Secretary. And these are going to be, as Mary says, 35,000 children who are going to have their lives turned upside down. And it's also the case, Liam, which I hadn't realised until this week, that extra classes, art, dance, drama, all the things that really add value to children's lives, piano lessons and so on, they too are going to be subject to VAT. So I cannot believe that this is in any way going to enhance the sort of cultural and educational firepower of our country. So we will certainly be returning to that issue, Marion. Thanks for the email. This is from Chris, who describes himself as a devoted and grateful Planet Normal listener.
Is there any other kind?
Is there any other kind? Some of them can get a bit bolshy. Rightly so. Dear Alison Liam, while sharing the sorrow and shock at learning of Alison's recent ordeal, I have to say that I think it may prove to be a very valuable catalyst. Every now and again, a punctuation point occurs in the global culture wars, which actually moves the dial in one direction or the other. The unlawful killing of a police suspect in the United States in 2020 led to some very unfortunate consequences, in my view, exacerbated by the effect of lockdown on young people in particular. Alison's experience could be another such point, the absurd circumstances and the feisty individual involved being key to the incident. Is this an AFM? Alison's freedom matters. Yay. Yeah, I won't ask anyone to take the knee. Maybe just buy me a cup of tea or something. I hope and feel it might well be, says Chris. Keep fighting and publicising the struggle, Alison. You're a tiger. And you have multitudes behind you who have had enough of this sort of absurdity, Chris. And I should just say, Liam, that this week, having been at various events, what's really gladdened my heart and taking part in the Telegraph's charity phone-in, which we both did on Sunday.
Wasn't that magnificent?
It really was. Great causes and some lovely people to talk to.
I was proud of the paper that day.
Yeah, it was great. But apparently the non-crime hate incident has now become a joke. And I think actually, when things become a national joke, you're well on the way to getting rid of them. And Brian, on that topic, says, Greg Wallace says, a handful of middle-class women of a certain age, a non-crime hate incident, surely.
And before we go, Alison, I'm very pleased to say that at the Telegraph Christmas charity phone-in, I sat next to none other than Annika Rice, who I once impersonated when I had that gig at the BBC. They didn't want me on to talk about serious things, so they had me on impersonating various people like David Bellamy and Austin Powers and Annika Rice on the fantastic show that was BBC This Week, which the BBC should bring back. I thought it was one of the best things on television, not only because I was on it quite often. And we are going to get the fantastic Annika Rice on the rocket of right thinking at some stage in the future. And on that bombshell, that's it from Planet Normal for another week as we leave our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reason views. Email of the week, it's my turn. Well, I think it has to go to Mari. Mari, we totally understand where you're coming from to our fingertips. We will monitor and support your cause. We will have guests on Planet Normal talking about this issue of VAT on school fees. So my email of the week is to Mari. Send us your postal address to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Put in the subject heading mug winner and you'll get your Planet Normal mug.
And just think how nice now co-pilot Halligan would look with his weight loss in the Annika Rice leggings. And the blonde wig.
I can actually borrow some of her actual leggings and they might fit.
I was on the other side of Liam at the phone-in and I know which feisty blonde was getting more attention from him. Not that I'm jealous. If you enjoy Planet Normal, and we jolly well hope you do, because we sweat buckets here, please subscribe to this podcast and leave us a rating and a review on Spotify, the podcast app, or wherever you listen. Helps others to find us so the Planet Normal family can grow. And just to say, there's a big march in London on Sunday, which is a march against anti-Semitism, but more broadly, it's a march for the values of the free world. So if anyone is around London, I'm going to be there. British Friends of Israel are going to be there. So come and find me and we'll have a group hug.
And as we speed away from Planet Normal and our beloved Planet Earth comes back into view, thanks to our producers, Isabel Bijard, Cass Ho and Louisa Wells. Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.